One of the advantages of syncing what I do on Sunday morning with the daily worship guide that we create, that many of you read throughout the week, with our small group study, is that by the time we get close to the end of a book, we have read and reread those books an amazing number of times. And what that means is that we have read them and hopefully have begun to move to a place of understanding. And so hopefully we can move to a place of beginning to say, okay, so how do we live this out in some way? And so at the end of what is traditionally our sermon time, I want to pose a couple questions to us this morning. How do we do what Jesus has asked the disciples to do? And what are the temptations, or some of the temptations that keep us from doing them, that distract us? And so if you keep those in the back of your mind, we'll come back around to them by the end. But I want to start this morning with a question. What happened after Jesus was raised from the dead? Several weeks ago, we started Mark's gospel, where he opens by assuming that the reader of this gospel knows that Jesus was raised from the dead, that this was good news, and that this good news somehow changed everything. As we've read Mark's telling of this good news, there are then a couple of things that stand out to us. The resurrection of Jesus is a declaration of victory over all of God's enemies. This is incredible news. Every cosmic or spiritual force that would seek to disorder God's good creation, whether it's the sea or the unclean spirits or even death itself, have been disarmed and have been revealed to be utterly powerless against the one who raised Jesus from the dead. This is incredible news. If this is true, then it is also true that there is a political revolution of some sort underway. The kingdom of God that Jesus shows up proclaiming has won the definitive battle. It has won the day. And so the kingdoms of our world have been put on notice. Their time is up, and the time for a new kingdom has come. These are huge claims, right? And so it is fair to follow up. What happened after this victory over sin and death? What has changed so far? Well, even a couple years down the road, Caesar is still the Roman emperor who has heard nothing of this peasant Jew stirring up revolutionary excitement in some backwater region of his empire. Pontius Pilate, who we will meet in next week's passage, is still the governor of this region. And he feels pretty good that having given the mob what they wanted, this man who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, he feels as though he's avoided the kind of rioting that surely would have resulted in him losing his job or being forced to move on. And then there's Herod, who still fancies himself as a legitimate ruler of the Jews, and his palace still stands and his lifestyle remains unaffected by Jesus and the news that he's been raised from the dead. And then you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests and the elders and the scribes, right? These are all the people that we've been hearing about as we've been reading this book together. Don't seem to have lost anything thus far in this revolution that changes everything. I mean, their social and their religious positions seem to be doing just fine. And so it's hard for this announcement of a new kingdom to not ring sort of hollow when all of the bits of the kingdoms of the world seem to remain intact. The rulers, the structure, and the systems are all still there. In the midst of this, Jesus is inviting people to see that even though everything in the world may still look the same, something, in fact, everything is fundamentally different. Do you trust him to give you the sight that you need to follow? Or do you trust your eyes that they are already capable of telling you how the world works? The reason that new sight is so important in this gospel, in fact, the reason it is essential that we are able to see and understand is because when Jesus becomes king, things seem to get worse for the movement that bears Jesus' name. So in chapter 13, the passage that Jessica read for us this morning, Jesus tells his disciples, as the chapter opens, you see all these great buildings? There will not be one left here, one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The great buildings associated with the temple will be thrown down stone by stone. And the disciples, they want to understand this a little bit better. What do you mean, Jesus? When will all of this happen and what will it look like? But in typical Jesus fashion, he doesn't answer the question that they ask. Jesus instructs them on what he seems to think is a more pressing matter. Do not be led astray. Stand guard. Endure. Because Jesus says, people are going to come in my name. People are going to come claiming to be me. In fact, there will be wars. There will be rumors of wars. Nations and kingdoms will rise up, and earthquakes and famines will bring these nations tumbling back down to earth. Then, in the midst of all of these global crises, each of you, followers of Jesus, are going to face personal threats. You'll be delivered over to councils. You'll be beaten in synagogues. You will stand in front of governors and kings on behalf of Jesus. These followers of Jesus will be required to say, there is only one Lord. There is only one King. And they will stand there as witnesses to the good news that Jesus is that Lord and King. This news that the disciples will announce will challenge and confront and critique the lives of everyone. And it will anger many. And it will divide households, Jesus tells his disciples. And those who preach this good news will be hated. And here's what's funny about the words that Jesus has for them here. None of this is new so far in his gospel, in Mark's gospel, because he's actually already told the disciples that they will drink the same cup of suffering as he will drink. If they follow him, if they will proclaim the same good news, they can expect to face the same treatment that Jesus is about to receive. But there's something powerful about the way that Jesus speaks of what is to come. And we'll talk about lowering the bar of expectations for what his kingdom might look like. If we thought his parable of a mustard seed sort of shrunk everything down, here he goes even further. Jesus essentially tells the disciples that there might be no discernible evidence that the kingdoms of this world are being shaken by the kingdom of God, let alone any sign that God has definitively defeated Satan, the unclean spirits, the demons, or Beelzebul, or whatever it is in this world that you fear. There may be no visible evidence that God has achieved the victory that he has promised. So what are we to do? It is in this arena of ambiguity, this landscape of uncertainty, that the disciples have to have the open eyes and open ears and open hearts and soft hearts that Jesus has been teaching his disciples about all along the way. Because if they cannot see the truth and cannot hear the words of Jesus and their hearts remain hard, they will falter and they will fail, and they will prove that in the chapters to come. But these, his disciples, his apostles, having seen Jesus raised from the dead, even they will be tempted to abandon that truth, that God raised Jesus from the dead, when it comes to embracing what they see in front of them. The disciples ask about the temple, and instead Jesus warns them about the challenges that they are going to face. Why? Well, depending on how you break up the First Testament, the argument could be made that half of the Hebrew Scriptures, half of what we generally call the Old Testament, is devoted to the single question, why was the temple destroyed? And Jesus has already answered this question for his people. The temple will be destroyed again. In verse 28, though, he says, from the fig tree learn its lesson. And Jesus points them back to the fig tree that we heard Ralph read about earlier this morning. The fig tree that showed signs of life but was not bearing fruit. Jesus judged it, and it withered. And so too would the temple face the same fate. When the time comes for the temple to be destroyed, Jesus expects his followers to look back to him, to remember his teaching, and to find its meaning in him and what he has taught. See, this is going to be decades later that this happens. And so his disciples are going to need to cling to his words, to cling to his instructions, and to remember why this has happened. They are to find the meaning of contemporary events in himself and in what he has said. And this is essentially what he is doing with the rest of this final warning. When earthquakes and famines destroy your lives, when they wreak havoc on your loved ones and on your communities, don't speculate about what they mean. Stay awake and trust me. When nations rise and fall, don't speculate about what is meant by them. Stay awake and continue to follow. When you suffer, when you are beaten in the synagogues, when you face death because you have proclaimed the good news that I am king, don't speculate about what this means. Stay awake, stand guard, and proclaim that truth that I am Lord. And when in the midst of all of these circumstances, people emerge to tell you that what these events mean is this. Here, follow this path. When people arise and offer you an easier alternative, when people show up and try to explain what is happening, and they do so in ways that are disconnected from the teachings of Jesus, refuse to listen, refuse to follow, stay awake and stand guard. Jesus is not interested in his disciples going through life engaging in endless speculation about the matters of the future, and so he essentially summarizes the future for them in a few short words. This is all you need. He sort of says to them, you will see me return in unmistakable glory, and I will gather my people from all over the earth. And when that happens, only the Father knows. So, until then, be on guard. Keep awake. You have been left with work to do, so get at it. So, what does it look like for followers of Jesus to stay awake and to stand guard, to endure, to work as servants in this kingdom? Well, it looks like the complete opposite of what the Jewish people of Jesus' time have been busy doing. Before we started Mark, we learned of Israel's mission when we studied Isaiah together. God showed up as his people were in exile in Babylon. And God remarkably brought Israel out of their exile with this intention, this purpose, that they would turn their lives toward him, that they would bear the fruit of justice and righteousness, and that they would be a light to the nations. This is what God intended to do through Israel from the beginning and now in their restoration once again. But Israel's return to the land was anything but triumphant. When it was announced that the Israelites were free to return, to leave captivity, to come back to the land that God had given to them, only some did. It turns out that many had established themselves pretty comfortably in Babylon. And so when the prospect of returning to their old land, a land that they didn't know, but their their great-grandparents may have known, and sort of rebuilding from scratch, they chose the comforts of Babylon and remained there. But then of those who did return, there wasn't much justice and righteousness, as some of the later prophets revealed to us, because Israel's leaders were back at their old power games once again. And when it came time to rally around rebuilding a temple, a monument of God's presence among his people, they really only could build it in fits and spurts. They would build a little bit, and then they would get distracted with, oh, I've got my own house to build. I'll take care of that. And then they would get back at it, and then they'd get distracted by something else. And it was this sort of pattern. Finally, Israel experienced some sense that there was a restored Israel, that they had been sort of restored almost in full. They had a temple in Jerusalem. They had walls protecting their holy city, except over a number of years, competing empires sort of trying to take over the land had left Israel without sovereign control over itself. Meaning Israel had yet to put a descendant of David back on the throne, somebody who rightfully could and should rule for them. And so what you have for Israel are centuries of life and existence sort of hung in a place of real tension. Always caught between world powers fighting over their land, always threatened by regional powers who took pleasure in mocking them and insulting them and so on. Israel's religious leaders responded in the only way that they could imagine. They sought to fortify themselves culturally. Not with the military, but by clearly defining their customs and their social boundaries. Who is in and who is out? Who can we trust? Who is with us? These are the kinds of questions Israelites were asking that gave them the hundreds of Sabbath rules that had some legitimacy in their midst, right? Who among us truly wants to see God restore Israel? If you really want God to do this for us, all of you will work as hard as you can to purify yourselves so that God can return in our midst, right? It was a way of sort of drawing a line. Who's really in? Who really wants God to act on our behalf? And so those who diligently follow every rule, who fervently pursue purity, who eat only what is clean and eat only with those people who are clean. That's how you know who is with us and who is not. And Jesus has been traveling around the country speaking against the religious leaders and their misguided efforts to purify themselves, to identify themselves merely by external factors. The other thing this lets Israel do over time is begin to develop a list of its enemies. The Gentiles are our enemies, right? They have destroyed us again and again. They are the worst. The Samaritans are our enemies. They're not pure Jewish. They're only half-breeds or whatever, right? The poor are our enemies. They are a blight on our good nation. The unclean are our enemies, always getting so close to us, trying to make us unclean. Those who are religiously laid back, they're our enemies. They don't care enough. They're not passionate enough. They're not zealous enough. So it's into this context that Jesus comes into the holy city. As Ralph read for us, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, entering the temple to bring his judgments against the powers that be. And for 2 chapters, he faces off against everyone. The chief priests and the scribes, the elders, the Pharisees, the Herodians, and the Sadducees. Confrontation after confrontation, Jesus boldly declares an alternative way of doing business with God. And his time in the temple is bookended by Jesus upending temple economics. He starts by turning over the tables of the money changers. We have heard this story many times. It's in all the Gospels. Buying and selling have no place in the temple. Then Jesus finishes his time in the temple by awkwardly sitting and watching as people put their offerings into the offering box. I don't know if you've ever caught that detail, but how awesome would that be if you knew Jesus was sitting here and we all had to come and be like, hey, Jesus, this is my best offering. I promise. But I guess you can sit over the offering box if you're Jesus. The closing verses of chapter 12, Jesus' final act in the temple, not to flip over the tables, but to flip the tables on the apparent generosity of the rich. So any faithful reader of Deuteronomy knows that the presence of the poor among you is an immediate judgment against you. Deuteronomy 15 says this: your generosity is lacking. Your fists are tightly closed if there are poor in your midst. But the Israelites had long developed an argument against that judgment. I can't give this money to the poor because I have to give to God. But then Isaiah comes along and says, you worship God, you love God, you honor God when you give to your neighbor. Acts of worship that function as an excuse for not caring for your neighbors can't be called worship. At least not worship that God accepts. So Jesus echoes Isaiah in this. But for the people of God, this was always about more than just what the rich did for the poor. The more important question was always, how did the rich become rich? And an answer to that question is hinted at in chapter 12, verse 38 through 40, where we read, and as Jesus was teaching, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts. Here it is. Scribes who devour widows' houses. They will receive the greater condemnation. It's not an accident that the very next thing to happen involves Jesus noticing a widow who has only 2 small coins to her name. This is a widow without a house because somewhere, someone has devoured it. See, in God's economy, in the economy of God's people, this is utterly inexcusable. The suggestion is more than strong that she is destitute because someone or some system or some people have taken advantage of her. Jesus has come to Jerusalem looking for fruit the way that God came looking for fruit in Isaiah. Came looking for justice and righteousness. And he looks around and all he finds is injustice and pretense. Religiosity that masquerades as something that's for God, but actually denies and rejects the things that God has asked the people to do. And when he calls it out, his opponents do the only thing you can do when a kingdom stands against your kingdom. You try to destroy the other kingdom. And his opponents began to plan for his destruction. But his time in the temple is about more than money. He starts with money and he ends with money. But after clearing the temple, Jesus teaches, is it not written that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? Jesus is drawing the people back to God's purposes for these people, for their existence in the first place. It was God's desire that they would be a kingdom of priests. That they were to offer up the prayers, offer prayers for salvation of the nations, and Israel's moral character was supposed to somehow be a light, was supposed to attract the nations, drawing them to come together and to worship their God. The temple This place where they were currently at was supposed to be filled with prayers for the nations and with the nations. This was God's purpose. And yet Israel for hundreds of years had only cultivated hatred and animosity toward the very nations that they were supposed to be inviting into worship with them. It's fascinating then that in verse 25, only a few verses later, Jesus will say, this is chapter 11, verse 25. Jesus will say, "And whenever you stand praying, forgive." You get the sense that the prayers that fill the temple are prayers for God's righteous judgment against the nations. If you read Psalms somewhat regularly, you might be familiar with some of these prayers that the Israelites were tempted to pray. Prayers that God would judge and appropriately destroy their enemies. Down with the Romans. Down with the Samaritans. God, I'm so glad I'm not like one of those wicked tax collectors. These are the flavor of the prayers that seem to be coming up in God's temple. But their prayers are to be prayers that request the strength, the ability to forgive anything they have against anyone, so that their Father also who is in heaven may forgive their sins. Is this not one of the most uncomfortable of all of Jesus' teachings? That somehow our ability to forgive others is directly tied to our forgiveness? Whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. This is the beginning of the end for Jesus. The leaders in Jerusalem are committed to overthrowing their enemies. They're not committed to praying for forgiveness for their enemies, or that they would forgive their enemies. And besides, in all actuality, their enemies are too many to count by this point, right? So which enemies should we forgive? This is a long list. And so, encounter after encounter, Jesus makes people mad as he announces that there is a better way of living in this world, that the kingdom he brings is fundamentally better than the kingdoms that the people around him are demonstrating their allegiance to. And yet, with no sign around him anywhere that anyone is with him, he remains faithful. You've heard people talk about decision making and how when trying to make a decision, should I move forward or should I not move forward? The question of whether doors are open or closed. For Jesus, there don't appear to be any open doors anywhere. There are no open doors in Jerusalem. There is only suffering and death. But this is the path that God has called him on, and he trusts God. And he asks his disciples to trust him and to follow him. And we get the impression from Mark 13 that if we will follow Jesus, if we will proclaim the good news boldly in the world, that we will find many of the doors that have been open to us closing. And the question for us remains, what do you do when all of the doors are closed? Following Jesus often looks like a closed door. And the way that Jesus describes our faithfulness, our following of him, he uses 4 different metaphors that sort of overlap and all work together. Staying awake, proclaiming the gospel to the nations, the good news, being on guard, and servants doing their work. So this is the part where you get to participate. Let me ask these 2 questions. What is involved in our staying awake, our remaining on guard, our proclaiming the gospel and doing doing the work of a servant today? So pick one of those 4 images, whichever one maybe resonates with you, or the one that you're most disinclined to resonate with. Pick one of them and say, what does it look like for us to do this, to live this, to follow Jesus in this way today.